let me give you a little bit of context to this paper, and then I'll summarize it in a couple of minutes, because it can be easily summarized. At our Department of Anthropology in Utrecht, we have, for the last 10 years, we recently switched, but between 2002 and 2012, we had a research program, unlike in the US and the UK, where more generally individual researchers go their own way and go their own direction. In Europe, they greatly believe in synergy, because then they can hold the chairman accountable for what the entire staff does, because there's no other ways of monitoring that group. So they really look for a coherent research program. Now, our program was called Political Conflict, Cultural Trauma, and Social Reconstruction. So from 2002, it has been my task to put all the noses in the same direction, that everybody does work on violence and trauma and conflict. And, but the result of that is that also in your teaching, of course, you have courses on violence and conflict and all these things, aside from your regular coursework on kinship and, you mentioned it, ethnomusicology and whatever. But the result of this is that students who are like a tabula rasa, and they hear this and they say, wow, this is exciting. So they all come with the most crazy projects that you say, you can't do this. You can't just go down, as I had one student said, yeah, I want to hitchhike to, this was during the war, I want to hitchhike to Chechnya and do research there on the rebels and on the resistance against the Russian army. I said, oh, no, we're not going to supervise this. You're not going to get your diploma if you go. The State Department doesn't want people to go. This is simply too dangerous. You can't do these things. But this is an ongoing thing. They want to study conflict. And if they can go to Chechnya or Iraq or Syria, if people want to go to Syria, yeah, because I have an uncle who lives in Istanbul. I said, yeah, Istanbul, Syria is 10,000 kilometers. That won't help you. But the result is that people do look for research. They want to do research on conflict, political conflict in particular. And then they return. And then you see their theses, their bachelor theses and their master theses. And we talk about that as faculty and see, well, where are the gaps in their knowledge? They come with all this material and they think they have the whole political spectrum, and then they only have the Communist Party, or they only have this, or they only have that. And then you talk to them and say, well, you really do have a problem here, because you got a very one-sided sample of the research area that you have been doing research on. And what you then try to do, you try to mend it, rhetorically in the thesis to make it an acceptable thing. So that got me thinking of what it is and what are the problems of them getting to a broader spectrum of politicians, activists, grassroots leaders, and also in some cases perpetrators. So that got me thinking, well, what were the lessons that I drew myself from my own fieldwork? And thanks to Aaron's kind and generous invitation to join a panel at the AAA, that got me going. Because the theme, approaching perpetrators, I took that very literal. How do you approach a perpetrator rather than how do you study them? I think how do you get to them? So that's what I tried to do. And the term that came to my mind was the term switchboard operator. And I don't think any of us, not even me, has ever seen a living switchboard operator. For those of you who are not familiar with the term, these are people who, you see them in old films, connecting. Like the Andy Griffith Show, of course, had a switchboard operator connecting a call through. And B wants to talk to so and so, and then listens in on the conversation, and everybody in the whole community knows what's happening. But these switchboard operators, they literally plug in and making connections, physical connections between people. And talking about this with Nancy Shepherd-Hughes, some months ago. She says, you know, as a matter of fact, my mother was a switchboard operator. That's how she made a living. She's a switchboard operator in the town where we lived. So when Nancy said that, I immediately thought, is switchboard operator the right term? And that's something I want to ask from you. If that's really, is it a metaphor? Is it something you can use in this particular sense? I tried to translate it into Dutch and I couldn't find, the right term. So I call it kind of bridge builder. Somebody builds bridges. That's kind of the translation. So that's the first term. And then looking at the literature, I thought, well, aren't these people simply brokers? These are brokers who have social capital and they exploit the networks. And that's what they're doing. So switchboard operator is simply relabeling a more than adequate concept, so we can use the razor of Occam and just get rid of switchboard operator and call them simply brokers. And then if you look at the, especially the more recent studies on brokers, in the 1980s and 1970s, especially in Europe and in Latin America, a lot of studies was done on brokers, on intermediaries. The mafia is, of course, the ultimate intermediary between the peasants that had to be repressed and the landowners who were living in the agro villas, the agro towns in Sicily. And the mafia were the intermediary who used violence to then prevent these peasants from going to the United States or Northern Europe and emigrate. So keep them tied to the country, collect some of the harvest, and then pass that on to the landowners who were doing all their politics in the cities. That's the role of the mafia. They're the ideal intermediary. They're violent brokers, you could say. But in the thinking about brokers in the last, well, especially thanks to the work of sociologists, now a distinction is made between individualistic brokers, brokers who are intermediaries for their own profit and want to retain that capital, and collectivistic brokers who do that for the good of the community or the good of the institution. So basically, these people, these switchboard operators I talk about, are collectivistic brokers, and I'd really like to have some input whether I should simply call them collectivistic brokers. I don't like the term very much, or use the more imaginative switchboard operators. So, to sum up my paper, basically, this paper is kind of an outline on how to find these. First of all, what are the qualities of these collectivist brokers or switchboard operators? What makes them switchboard operators? And as I explained in the paper, they basically have 6 characteristics, and that distinguishes them from these violent brokers like the mafia and other types of brokers that you have, in every society, modern society, who connect people and draw profit from that, and also try to increase their profit and social capital by harboring and holding on to these contacts. So, well, the first characteristic is that they work discreetly in the background of political conflicts and factional struggles. So they're not really known publicly as brokers, while other brokers that work in the marketplace precisely do that. That's precisely what they want to know. They want people to know that they're effective in connecting bits of networks and also maintain that gap in these networks. That's their capital. So firstly, they work discreetly in the background. Secondly, they're ideologically neutral. That's the only way they can work between factions and connect factions or connect different groups, that are not pronounced politically and ideologically, even though privately, of course, they have their ideas. But they don't use their ideology as an asset, you could say, being on one side or the other and then establishing ties. So they're not ideologically pronounced. The third is that they function as communicative bridges between factions that otherwise have no way of communicating, especially communicating outside the line of command. Because, of course, when you have a military and you have to do a particular operation, you have lines of command, you have a hierarchy of command. that, okay, you know, we're going to attack this thing, and you need support from the engineering, and you need support from artillery, and then your infantry moves in, and the cavalry moves in. So there needs to be communication, formal communication between these branches of the, in this case, the army. But there are also all sorts of indirect communications going on, communications that are not tactical in nature, but rather strategic. You want to know where the others stand. If you want to know whether you should invest in drones or you should invest in more boots on the ground, and that has great implications financially. So you have to sense what do these other branches want, and this of course is even more important when there is an active conflict going on, like in Argentina. Especially in the time when I did research there. So you need these informal lines to know where do you want the military to head 20 years from now. And you need these informal contacts. So that's the third characteristic, a communicative bridge between factions. The fourth is that these switchboard operators, they don't have institutional power. They're not a general, or they're not on the, on the staff, or they're not, they're usually retired military. The fifth is that they are disinterested. They do not have clear personal interest in, however, these communications, in whatever direction they go. And finally, they are trustworthy. You can give them secret information, and they will not spill those beans, because they know that once they do, then that's the end of their role as a switchboard operator. So these are the characteristics, at least I'm extrapolating, of course, from my own research in Argentina, but there's also been work done by some very interesting Italian and political scientists who've been working on the mafia and criminal organizations that I've been drawing on. So, in closing, finally, how do you find these people then? And this is the lesson that I want to impart on my students. Well, the first lesson I teach them is that the snowball method won't work. It's a method we all use to get into contact with research participants. It's a great method. Do you know anybody who could inform me this? Do you know anybody? And that's how you work, But this becomes a very slanted, one-sided sample of the research population, because, as I discovered myself, faction members tend to connect researchers mostly with like-minded men, because that is in their interest, And I noticed that with one of the generals that I talk about here, Diaz-Besone, because he wanted his vision of what this so-called dirty war, whatever you want to call it, and later with Beatrice, we're going to look at the intersections between dirty war and what does it mean with dirty and the work you do. They want to convince you of their point of view. So they think, the more people I connect them to that are like-minded, that's the vision he will present then in his writings, you see. And they know, and anthropologists fall into this trap. We have this kind of notion that if something is very difficult to get, if something is very far away, or it's almost impossible, then it's valuable information. And Jeff has given in some of his other work some great examples of students who go to lengths and great danger to find material that's simply not worth it. Drug dealers, they work by supply and demand. Simply the demand goes up, okay, the price goes up. You don't have to join, a drug syndicate to be able to discover that. There's lots of stuff you could find without endangering yourself. But there is this notion that when you I really got to talk to this person, or I went through this ritual and I saw, and there were only 3 people present, and we had to climb up the mountain and all. No, you could have gone just in the same neighborhood, you know, with exactly the same process, exactly the same ritual. So that's one of the things you get yourself. And okay, I finally talked to this, oh yeah, I'm done before that. I finally talked to this general, and you think, I really got something important, and it really isn't. So snowball method doesn't work. You have to be careful about that. Secondly, also it's important to avoid relying on one switchboard operator. Actually, a nice example of that is Danny Hoffman, who I really appreciate, and his work is great, but he has an article in African Affairs where he's relying on this one research participant of this one rebel organization, and he's completely dependent on him. Now, I can imagine that in certain circumstances you have to do that because otherwise you cannot survive. But it's very tricky. You get a very one-sided, self-interested information. And also factions are divided, so you need to find multiple switchboard operators. Third, switchboard operators may belong to the same institution or even the same branch in case of the armed forces. So it's important that you do not only pay attention to the dynamics inside a faction or between factions, but also extra-factional connections. As I explained in this paper, I got to certain people through a bishop. You know, that was the person to connect to. Fourth, and next to final, you can find switchboard operators by frequenting public places. This is the famous, Jerry Berryman about India called hanging out. You just hang out in cafes. And that's what I did. At a certain moment I found that there were certain places where military would gather at a polo match or a horse racing track or a public lecture or things. And I would just sit in this cafe or restaurant and then watch military dressed as civilians. But if you do long enough research, you know them by face. And you say, hey, this person is talking to that person. How strange. I've never seen, there's a third person sitting. Who's this guy? You ask the waiter, give him a tip. I say, here you got 100 pesos. Who's that third person? So and so. What do you know it is? Okay, and write it down, and that's how you track them. And finally, asking switchboard operators themselves for other switchboard operators sounds like the most logical thing to do. It didn't work for me. Because maybe they were collectivistic operators for the armed forces, but they were individualistic brokers for themselves. And I don't know if I'm that valuable, but maybe they wanted to monopolize that contact. So in this way, and thanks to Aaron, I was able to write this all up and in a lecture a couple of months ago, imparted that on my students, and I hope that now they're in the field, they can profit from that. Okay, thank you.